Welcome to another episode of Before You Kill Yourself with your host, Leo Flowers. I am Leo Flowers. Today's guest is Victoria Shepard, the author of A History of Delusions, The Glass King, A Substitute Husband, and A Walking Corpse. What is the difference between being delusional or just being narcissistic? Why would someone wake up and claim they're Napoleon? Or believe they have been turned into a wolf and demand to be fed raw meat? For centuries, we've dismissed delusions as something for doctors to sort out behind locked doors. But delusions are more than just bizarre quirks. They hold the key to collective anxieties and traumas. In fact, the National Institute of Mental Health found that 1 in 5 U.S. adults are living with a mental illness. We are living in a time where more of us are focused on our mental health than ever. As author Victoria Shepard found, there are fascinating parallels between delusions over the years and contemporary discussions around mental health. In A History of Delusions, The Glass King, A Substitute Husband, and A Walking Corpse, Victoria Shepard, who received or conceived and produced the 10-part series A History of Delusions for BBC Radio 4, uncovers stories of delusions from medieval times to the present day and implores us to identify reason in apparent madness. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode is remarkable, so let's get into it. Welcome, Victoria Shepard. So your book, A History of Delusions, I found fascinating for a number of reasons. But for the listeners, who may not know what a delusion is, please just give us a working definition.
So yes, the working definition is really important, obviously, because there's so much. Minds are not neat. And, it's been very important in researching this book to take the sort of, I took the clinical definition from when the early, as psychiatry would sort of refer to it, as a fixed false idea that a person clings to, an unshakable belief that a person clings to despite lots of evidence to the contrary. The evidence won't shake, essentially. And so those are very much the parameters. A person with a delusion may well be high functioning. It may be only one fixed false belief, but that's the working definition within which each of the characters in my book from history sit within.
Well, it's so interesting because Michelle, my girlfriend, and I were just watching this TV series called The Dropout about Elizabeth Holmes. I don't know if you've heard of her, but so she started this company called Theranos, and seemed to be quite delusional throughout the process in terms of really believing that she could create this product and get it out and it'd be safe for everybody. And now she's looking at jail time because of her belief in the delusions.
It's really interesting because although my book is ostensibly a social history, I've looked over many centuries at people from the past who've experienced delusions. But a really interesting piece of research that really got me gripped, retrospectively, obviously, but was in 1991 in Baltimore. There were, for the first time, large-scale studies of the general population looking at delusion. So this is crucial to the book and to what I'm sort of doing with it. And they'd never bothered to ask the general population about delusional thinking is the key point. The only people who'd ever been studied and sort of objectified really as, marvels of the mind or bizarre, freak shows really at the worst of it, but certainly kind of bizarre marvels of the mind. Those are the only people who'd ever been spoken to by psychiatrists and made it into any kind of book to be measured or, for any kind of taxonomy. But when these studies in the late 80s and in 1991 particularly bothered to ask the general population, it turned out that we're all delusional. We all have at least one fixed false belief about ourselves that if we asked people closest to us, they'd say, no, that's not true. And so that's what's really interesting. It's a great leveler, delusional thinking. There are extremes. Of course, we're not all at an extreme end of it. But it was humbling researching this book and made me feel very compassionate and humane about people. It sounds kind of highfalutin, but being alive, really. You know, I realized looking at all of these people, they had so much in common in terms of how their delusions were functioning for them psychologically. And it was all about people wrestling with a really difficult reality, and that was what was inspiring them, unconsciously, of course, sometimes, often, but to create an alternative reality within which they could live, you know, where they could organize their enemy. And that's what conspiracy theories or, you know, delusional, so often that, you know, it's in a world of kind of ambiguity and conflicted feelings and ambivalence or nebulous threat, you know, delusion. Whether it's you know, I'm Napoleon, or whether it's I can pull off this business venture, no problem. You know, it's a rather ingenious strategy for a very difficult existence, and most of us, on a scale, of course, but experience that struggle with reality, with a wretched existence. And I've gone off your question a bit wildly, but you know. The historical examples that the lives that I kind of explore in my book, it all comes back to this fact about that we all have to assimilate and realize about ourselves, our own potential for delusional thinking, both for positive and potentially strategically. You know, they can be incredibly useful scaffolding within a difficult existence, and that kind of blew my mind. I found that so. Moving, really. I mean, I was writing this during lockdown, so everything was quite intense anyway, you know, in my garret pent in London. But yeah, I felt that people started talking to each other, the different characters, different types of delusion, but there were so many shared functions and strategies, and I really did feel that that all of those principal reasons why people create an alternative reality for themselves, have a fixed false belief, they're still true, and they're much, much more interesting than they might first appear. They're less other, they're less bizarre, and in fact, they're completely, I argue in the book, but I do think it stands up, that they are completely understandable. You know, they are, if you really unpick the lives of people who've experienced delusions, just on a psychodynamic level, you can understand with all of them where they've come from, and you kind of often quite impressed with them as strategies, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. You know, two things come to mind. One is children. Children have no idea dipping in and out of delusions, so to speak, and pretending that they're a king or a princess or a dog or a superhero, and we entertain that, and you know, we don't look at that as a strange or a mental illness or something to be ostracized or demonized. And kids grow up to flourish and become adults and functioning in the world, and for some reason, as adults, all of a sudden you want to be Spider-Man or Superman, and now we have an issue with it. And not recognizing that it can be a response to, like you said, you know, some traumatic event or even loneliness, you know,
Right.
you know, just like you said, you know, you wrote this during the pandemic. And I think if you're like most people, like we probably talk to ourselves a little bit more, you know, just because of the isolation and withdrawal, and I think people understood it, that, okay, this is acceptable behavior versus pre-pandemic, where people would have been like, why are you talking to yourself? And why is that strange?
Totally. And actually some other contemporary research that I came across doing really good work at the University of Sheffield in the north of England, you know, they've done a lot of work into a sense of belonging and connection in communities. And there's a direct obverse, is that the right word? Correlation between a sense of belonging and delusional thinking. The more connected you are. I mean, it's not if it's just sort of obvious, but I still found it kind of enlightening. The more you experience a sense of belonging, the more cohesive a community is, the more connected you are, opposite in lockdown, the more you're able to let go of delusional thinking, or you're just not tempted by it. You don't need it. So that it's absolutely those things are those states of belonging or not belonging are absolutely connected to delusional thinking. And I did find with each of these characters from the past, again, I kind of forgot that they were existing in other centuries and decades, because essentially what they're asking for is to be worthy of interpretation. Delusions are often sort of encoded. They're telling the world how to treat you. So I have the case of a king of France in the 14th century who thought he turned into glass and would shatter if he sat down. So he's publicly he's fighting a war with England in the 100 Years' War, but privately he's panicking that if he bumps into the wall he's going to shatter. So it's kind of absurd. It's funny, but glass. This is how I got obsessed with the subject in the first place, was finding this one case, and it spoke to me. And I knew there was something really interesting in it. And of course, if you're made of glass, it tells the world how to treat you. It tells the world that you're fragile, to stay back, basically. It's like social anxiety. And I found many contemporary cases of people who believe that bits of them have turned into glass. But it also tells the world that you're precious, you're a kind of treasure. Of course, glass was was extremely new in the home when he was around in the 14th century. So people hadn't really seen it. And the idea that you could kind of heat sand, bits of rock, and it would turn into this kind of beautiful, transparent material was sort of like alchemy, kind of extraordinary. But anyway, so my point being that it's a powerful way of telling the world how to treat you, and asking to be uncoded, asking to be decoded, asking for really serious attention. And I think that that's probably something really, after working on this book, every single character, whether it was a French housewife in the 1920s who thought her husband had been, murdered and exchanged for a double, or, another Frenchman, all of them are French because that's where the psychiatry kind of began, but women who thought that George V was in love with her, they're all actually, when it comes down to it, demanding or really asking for something, just the dignity of being sort of sat with somebody entering into their reality, even if it's only halfway. I think a lot of the doctors have understood that over time, even when the kind of mental health treatment was brutal and horrific and people were institutionalized for the rest of their lives, and it was pretty awful. I think even within that context, doctors often understood that if they just entered into the delusion just a few steps, it would allow people to kind of confess and let go a bit of their delusion. And essentially, at the underpinning, it was often, and is often, a desire to be worthy of interpretation, worthy of attention. It's such a simple thing, but easy to forget, I think.
Well, the beauty of that, two things is a lot of times, like I took an improv class and they have this game called Yes and it's, one person creates a world or a delusion and you just say yes to it and then you build on it. And then it becomes this fun, kind of thing where we get so caught up in what we believe the realities of things should be, and not wanting to appear crazy or appear that we have a mental illness, that any sign of it, we shut down and try to get things back on track versus entertaining it and recognizing that that's actually the way to get back online or back to some semblance of reality, or some, a working presence that we could have. But
for sure.
This idea of meeting people where they are is, if you're talking to a 3-year-old, you wouldn't start pontificating about physics and astronomy. You would meet the kid where they are. But I think as adults, we just feel like we have this image of what an adult is,
Yeah.
and anything outside of that, we try to erase or eliminate or shame or guilt, not recognizing that we all have this 9-year-old also running around inside of us, and that delusions is a survival mechanism for some people at some point in time. And I feel like that's what you're kind of saying is like, the delusions that I'm experiencing is a response to the world around me.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting what you say about children. I hadn't thought about it in any detail, but I think that's right. And in that sense, that maybe that's one of the things, thinking about it, that really got me interested, was that, social conformity is such a strong, as you say, being adulting, being an adult, being not quote unquote, basically the common sense reality, agreeing, like signing up to common sense reality, saying this is basically what we all agree is real, would seem to be, and it is so important to our social survival, not being ostracized or laughed at, even worse, the worst thing thought of as ridiculous. And yet people cling to delusions for dear life. They're like phobias in a way. Phobia is a kind of delusion, I guess. That was actually interestingly where I realized I was thinking, I don't think I have one. I must have one, but I don't think I do. And then, I've got a lift phobia. And in talking to somebody, I suddenly thought, oh God, it was quite a salutary moment. I realized that was doing exactly the same function. As long as I stay away from lifts, or then everything is, then I'm in control. And it kind of organizing your enemy. And so then that's what got me thinking, or gets anyone in this field thinking, is that people who are, given that they're sacrificing and risking so much to say in public, I'm made of glass, or my husband's, can I have a divorce, please? My husband's a double, or whatever it is, or I'm already dead. A very painful and strange one, a phenomenon of people who which has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, who kind of self-annihilation in the delusion that they just don't exist anymore. They're already dead. They've died already. They're risking everything. So what the hell is it offering them? Because it must be something. It must be something really, really useful, protective, strategic. Otherwise, you just wouldn't do it. And then when you start to answer that question, you can answer it. you begin to be able to answer it. It seems like you just think, well, no, they're just out of their mind. But it's a very, very powerful thing to create an alternative reality and ask other people to come and tour it. So that, as you say, children don't have that same sense that they have to, just as you say, that they have to sign up to common sense reality yet. They haven't signed that contract. They haven't, and they're already. I guess that the phenomenon of people saying that they've been adopted. That's a classic child's fantasy, isn't it? That your life isn't ordinary, or that if your life is really awful, that again, that oh well, it's okay because they're not my real parents. That my real parents are the king and queen of Bavaria. And I have a character, Margaret Nicholson, who thinks she's the rightful heir to the British throne in 1796. But she's doing the same thing, really. She's just doing it aged 30, whatever she was, 36. But it's a really interesting thing to think about how children treat, or we wouldn't call them delusions.
Well, it's almost an invitation to play.
Yeah.
It's like an adult version of, hey, do you want to play?
Yeah.
Because that's something that I've am struggling with right now, is this idea of like, I know how to perform, I know how to prepare, I know how to practice. I'm finding that I'm really bad at playing. And I think that I have a friend. My sister used to suck her thumb when she was a kid, and some kids used to carry around a blanket and these things that we have as security items. And as adults, we kind of lose those things, and to appear like an adult. And I think we also lose the ability to play and just kind of fantasize and wonder. it could be a suppression of that, where then the backlash is the extreme delusions. Like not letting it out slowly, not expressing it occasionally. It's almost like if you don't walk the dog starts to tear up the house, kind of thing. For the listeners, there's no science behind what I'm saying. I'm just
that's really interesting. That's really interesting about as an idea that it would be. I mean, even the word delusion, from the Latin ludo, ludere, to play. You're absolutely, that's bang on, isn't it? That at the heart of it is a kind of challenge to engage in a game where you say this is reality, even though it was deadly serious. They're never ever. They might seem absurd, but they're life and death to the person experiencing them. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge to play in the non-silly sense of the word. And I think society does tell us that once we're grown up, quote unquote, we shouldn't play. And that's a really interesting way of interrogating it. Is it a kind of snapping finally, the kind of psychic, what's the word, kind of backlog? Slightly disgusting metaphor there, but that could kind of create something very extreme. I buy that. I think there could well be something in that. I mean, I've seen often, trying to kind of organize it, and I look at all these cases, and I found three really clear triggers, if you like. Reversal of fortune, a kind of people dealing. Often you find that delusions come out of a reversal of fortune, a humiliation. Often with women, it's being sort of dumped by a lover, often because, that humiliation could be not just in terms of pride, but in terms of financial security as well. So, in the past particularly, but it's still true now, I suppose, in certain places, but, or irreconcilable, not being able to continue, that's to kind of hold together conflicting ideas. I found that often, that's often at the back of conspiracy or paranoid delusions, which are the most common and have been. I have a case from the 1790s, but it's got more and more and more common, and now it's the most common delusion by far, for fairly obvious reasons, that presents itself. But often at the back of that is people, again, it's like a coiled spring. So that's what kind of reminded me, given what you were just saying, this idea that people, psychic stress, essentially, the psychic stress of not living a kind of communicative life where you're you're accumulating psychic stress, and you sort of snap, and out of that comes in James Tilly Matthews' case, he's this spy in the double agent spy in the French Revolution, who I'm talking about. So this is all the way back in the 1790s again, but it was the same. Hadn't had much education, autodidact. He'd gone to a few lectures, got himself on a ship to France with the public, lots of public figures. Amazing that he got himself in that position. But then, of course, he got into terrible trouble. The French thought he was a spy for the English. The English thought he was a spy for the French, and he was kicked back to London and living in poverty with his wife and daughter, with no way of making any money. And out of that sprang this extraordinary delusion that the French revolutionaries were trying to overthrow the British government, bring the revolution to London, but they were using a machine that emitted magnetic forces to work on the politicians in Westminster. So it's kind of wild, imaginative delusion, but it was a psychic. It's like I think there's something in what you're saying very much about psychic pressure and people snapping, but that becoming a kind of birthing these imaginative artifacts. Really, they're strange and they're incredible often, as feats of imagination. They sit somewhere between fairy tales often and ghost stories, and they're so imaginative that they're like artworks, and I don't want to trivialize it, because also people can be a danger to themselves. They can be a danger to others. It's not a funny It's not a trivial subject. And I have to be careful when I talk about it to acknowledge that, there's a dangerous and painful edge to delusions that has to always sort of be acknowledged. Even as I'm saying that they're kind of amazing stories, which they are, that people have kind of offer up.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about some of the commonalities that that lead to delusions that we see in adults, and tell me, because we're talking about like the Glass King earlier, and there's
Yeah.
a few other instances where it seemed to be that, because we were talking about psychic stress, and in people who are suicidal, they typically report a psych ache. And I bring that up to say that typhoid fever seems to have been a commonality in some of the examples in the book. And I would assume that
Yeah.
when we think about fever, there's a stress mentally, a psychic stress, a heating up of the brain. Did you find that in all of them, or was there a through line with that?
In many of them, yes, they'd be, and obviously it's just a side note, often in the case notes of these 19th century French psychiatrists, because this is where they were all for the first time writing these things down and talking to people. And there'd be a line saying had diphtheria, had typhoid, all the way back to the King of France had a, as you're alluding to, had a really serious kind of meningitis level inflammation of the brain fever. And it's the biological dimension is really interesting. And obviously we can't scan these characters that I'm focusing on and whose lives I'm exploring. But goodness, I wish we could, because it'd be fascinating to know how much of it. I think they are understandable on a psychological level, all of them. But there's often, the right front cortex seems to be where it's at with the kind of sophisticated scanning now. That if that gets inflamed, your recognition, it's who I am in relation to other people, all of that goes on in the front right part of your brain. And if that gets inflamed or damaged, or through blunt trauma, or through fever or disease, that there's a kind of dementia that does it too, Lewy bodies, that your left brain sort of steps in and creates a narrative to explain to your mind why you recognize somebody, but you don't, they're not, or they're familiar, but you don't recognize them, is one case with the delusion of doubles, for example. But even if it's not the delusion of doubles, it seems to be a lot of the cases have mention of fever, illnesses, very serious illnesses in adolescence, which would have affected the front right cortex. Initially I found that quite challenging, because I was so set on explaining or trying to understand these delusions psychologically, and as a reaction to difficult realities, or like a really wretched existence, and I stand by it. I think they are always understandable. But there may also I have to accept that they may have had inflammations, or there may be organic brain reasons why their delusions appeared too. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And it's tantalizing because you can't know. But that seems to be the way it's pointing. I mean, there's really interesting brand new research about a particular ovarian tumor that has forgive this quite crude, obviously I'm not a neurologist, but that has very similar cells to the right front brain, and the immune system can mistake the two and attack the front right brain, thinking that it's the same disease as the ovarian tumor. And they now think that may well be the cause of many historic cases of what they thought was, quote, demonic possession, or very kind of wild delusions of the past. They think may well have been this particular type of tumor. So that's a kind of frontier they're going to carry on knowing, but I don't think it's not going to eclipse the psychological understandability of delusions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I was looking up fevers, and they say like once your fever hits around, I think 103, then we can start to have hallucinations and
Mm,
delusions anywhere between 103, 106 that can
mm,
kick in. So
mm.
there's something like heat related. It seems like just
Yeah.
extrapolating from that. Um, and it also speaks to I know at least for myself when I'm experiencing some type of psych ache,
Mm,
cold water, cold showers,
mm.
kind of ground me and bring me back into reality. And I feel like when you watch old movies, there's always the trope of somebody going mad and then cold water's thrown in their face, or and then they like snap out of it, man, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So on a visceral level, I think we're aware of how heat and cold, how temperatures
Mm,
can affect our mind state. But
mm.
in the book, what I also thought was really fascinating was you seem to allude to how the delusions seem to take place for people like in their 40s. Like we
Mm.
don't see it a lot in their 20s or 30s, and I wonder how much of that is tied to the hormonal changes in both men and women, where like the testosterone is going up, or up in women and down in men, and or if there are other like,
Yeah.
did you find any?
It came to me, the realization came to me probably because I'm a woman in my 40s. So I wasn't looking at straight at that. And then I suddenly, another salutary moment, I was like, wow, they're all roughly my age, all, a lot of them in their early 40s. And yeah, I mean, again, I hadn't considered the kind of hormonal aspect, but certainly, there would be a case for that. There's also, if you look at it psychologically, I mean, the French woman who walked into the police station asking for a divorce because her husband was a double, had been murdered, and he was a double. I mean, I allude to it. I can't prove it, and there's no way of ever proving it. But she was clearly ambivalent about her husband. To put it mildly, hated his guts, quite possibly. And there was no chance of a divorce, or certainly not initiating a divorce if you were a woman at that time in France. So, again, it's a sort of stage of life. It's a kind of middle age, I suppose you might say. And where, so even if it's the fact of a kind of children have, growing up, or whatever, that is a kind of crisis point to do with middle age, whether it's hormonal or psychological or bad marriages, which is what I felt. Or a moment. I mean, it's really interesting because, and again, this is just conjecture, but Leah Anna Bay, who is the character who thought that George V was in love with her, it's kind of reverse stalking. It manifests as the same as stalking. But you take no responsibility for it because the person with erotomania, it's the other person who's just desperately in love with you. And so it's not your fault. And so it makes it quite a very potentially dangerous delusion because it takes no responsibility for the delusion or for what happens. But in Madame X, who was a woman in the 1880s in France who told everybody that she'd already died. I found moments in their past, and it was interesting. That's the same kind of gap. They were both in their 40s, early 40s. And these were things in childhood, intriguing kind of moments that popped out for me in researching. So she said something catastrophic had gone wrong in her communion, in her Holy Communion, which at the time would have been the biggest event in a French little girl's life, when you take the sacrament and you have to fast and confess. And I kind of try and guess at what on earth could have gone so wrong in front of the priest or her family at this communion, that she, all these decades later, it's something she's telling her psychiatrist about. But it's clearly a trauma not a war trauma that we see often in delusions, but a trauma nonetheless, something that we can't. And Leah Annaby, who was experienced erotomania. Again, she gives this account to her doctor of burning photographs of her family who'd been in the Boer War in the 1880s. Again, weird image, kind of arresting image. Don't know. Something dark, family secrets. Something terrible had happened in her family, and she gives us this glimpse that kind of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You kind of tell in these moments that there's something really charged in them, even though you can't ever, of course, know the full backstory. And it's interesting that the gap between those traumas was the same. And it was like, I don't know what you think about that, but about whether there's some kind of natural moment in your 40s when you process trauma, whether it's just simply getting a bit older or having a bit more time from having young babies, or I don't know. But it's a really interesting thing to consider, that there's some kind of natural moment of appraisal that goes on psychically, that stuff kind of comes out like a bruise. I'm a historian, so, but it definitely felt as though, and again, even with Robert Burton, who's even further back, 1500s, he believed his own. He's a man who seemed to believe his own horoscope that told him he was going to die. He was kind of around at the same time as Shakespeare, and astrologers were big celebrities in Elizabethan London, and he'd visited one as a young man, and it told him he was going to die suddenly when he was exactly on the day he was going to die suddenly, or the year he was going to die suddenly. And again, the same kind of gap. And it's an interesting thought that there's something about that. There's something psychological going on at that period. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, yeah, because I think it could be the tale of two cities in terms of being in your 40s, where on one hand, we might become busier than ever because we've accumulated years and decades of experience in a particular field. And so we have so much purpose, and we're surrounded by a bunch of people. Or the flip side happens where you're like you said, it's a reversal of fortunes, where you've been successful most of your life and you've had purpose and people around you. And then all of a sudden, we lost a lot of people during a pandemic. People have lost their jobs. And now all of a sudden you have all of this free time, this unstructured time to yourself to feel all the things and to think about, what your life means. And also I think 40s is a time where injuries occur, whether it's a back injury, knee. So the amount of physical pain increases, and it's new pain, in your 20s. And when you're a kid, you don't, unless like you were born with some type of chronic or acute type of situation, pain doesn't really show up in the body on a consistent basis until you hit your 40s. And then that can lead to a questioning of life and what do I do? How do I take care of this body? So I think because yesterday I did a podcast about naval suicides. And what was interesting, it's been 4 this year, and they were on a ship that's been docked since 2017. And one of the things they were saying is military servicemen don't really end their lives when they're in conflict because they have purpose and surrounded by people. It's when there's no conflict and they just have all this extra time to themselves. So I wonder if, that part of that reversal of fortune, losing the house, losing money, the marriage is crumbling. Now you have this extra time to reflect and regret and feel the pain that we've been suppressing with busyness.
Yeah. And that you can't deny, there's a kind of a body of time that has passed in your consciousness that you can't deny anymore. There's a freight, isn't there, of experience. It's what you were alluding to, but it's just there. it seems to be a kind of critical mass of that. Even in your 30s, you can still, it still doesn't feel quite real. And I think the pandemic's definitely, I mean, obviously the loss and an illness, but even just time slips, there's something very strange and untethered has happened to time. And certainly delusions seem to me to be a real yearning for kind of scaffolding. I kept thinking about, like, it's just an image, and I mean, it does literally come up. I kind of borrowed it from, but people kind of cut adrift at sea, holding onto them like a life raft. People nobody likes being untethered. We need a framework, and delusions are kind of sometimes very poetic, sometimes not, but they are scaffolding, aren't they? They're the door in the Titanic. They're the floating door that you can kind of you can cling on to.
Yeah, when you're talking about Madam M in the book, one of the things that seemed to come up also is the economic disparity that a lot of these people are living in. And I wonder how much of a split society can lead to a split personality, right? Like the more the wealthier get wealthy and the poor get poor, then I feel like we as a human being feel like we have to adapt or die in an extreme way. Like, I don't want to be impoverished and drinking polluted water, and the climb to being wealthy seems so high. So you almost have to create this. It both seem hopeless, I would imagine, for somebody in the middle.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about Madame M. So she's the for your listeners, she's the woman who thought her husband had been replaced by a double. She's living in Paris during the First World War, and she'd grown up as a seamstress, as a petit mouse, so just doing the really kind of difficult work, making dresses in the rising couture industry in Paris. She'd probably come, hard to know, but she'd probably come as a migrant to the city from somewhere more rural. And the Belle Epoque, I mean, there's so many parallels. The rhymes are just there, the Belle Epoque's in full flow of this kind of very showy, this isn't, the 1880s. Before the First World War, people are living high on the hog. It's like Instagrammable, pre-internet Instagrammable stuff going on in Paris. But of course, a good half, more than half, would have had no access to that whatsoever. And you can't, how, she will have had all those things that we have now about, hang on a minute, you're watching television, everyone's watching television now or online, and seeing these lifestyles that they maybe get a bit of stardust from. Maybe they buy expensive perfume that's kind of, stardust from the couture lines that actually nobody buys because nobody can afford them. About 6 people buy the haute couture, and all the rest of us mugs buy the, $100 a drop perfume to kind of get some style. So that, again, that what we were talking about earlier, the psychic kind of conflict that's building up between what you see is there, but you can't get, but it's there, and you're very, very close to it. She was working in couture, so she was literally making her hands bleed, making these incredibly theatrical dresses for the upper middle classes who for the first time had lots of spending money. And you can't help but think about the oligarch level. Well, obviously that's another story, but the uber rich now, and the kind of conflict that sets up in a mind that's both ambition or natural ambition, like Madame M, she'd come to Paris. She then marries up, in inverted commas, but she marries a guy who's got a dairy business. It's doing really well. And then the war comes. She experiences the death of children through disease. Horrible, horrible personal trauma. Husband who doesn't sound like I can't know, but you just, doesn't sound like your dream partner, like your twin flame. And she then, as you said, as we were talking about, the reversal of fortune, and out of that comes this idea that it's easier basically for her, with his my interpretation, or a sort of psychoanalytic interpretation, it's easier to deal with the idea that your husband's not your husband, that he's been swapped for a double. In fact, her delusion then extends to the children haven't died; they've been abducted, and in fact, the men who've disappeared into the First World War and died in the trenches in this horrific mass death a few miles away outside Paris, they haven't died either. They're underground in the catacombs in Paris, and we just need to rescue them. It gives her a job to do, gives her. Because there's a plot to be kind of uncovered, and the police just, she's always asking the police to get involved. But again, sorry, I've gone off piece, but the kind of psychic ratcheting up again of pressure, of things that she can't bear, and that being something, and one of those things very definitely being a disparity. She obviously has. She's so close to this fabulous Belle Epoque lifestyle, and it's complete, and it's gone. First of all, then she can't quite get it, then she nearly gets it. And then everything then there's this horrific flip and fortune. And for many, many people with the First World War, all the men died, so yeah, but you were talking specifically about the financial, about what disparity in society might do to minds. And I think certainly that kind of coupling of yourself and what you do in your life, and then therefore what you're rewarded with, when that becomes uncoupled, when things are just unfair, they're just not, it wouldn't matter how, there's no way of controlling it. That's not for you. That tranche of, in her case, these are the French upper middle classes, and the empire's doing really well. And there's suddenly all this there's all this money in the economy, but it's for the very tiny, tiny top percent. And there's nothing she can ever do about that. She just has to look at it. And the pressure that would build, the kind of, and it makes complete sense that would be a kind of fertile ground. And then, of course, the lighting, the touch, a great trauma like she did experience would often is the case, but actually triggering the delusion. Yeah.
Yeah. What's beautiful about what you shared is, even if you are the top 1% and you're wealthy and rich, I would imagine there's a powerlessness that one could possibly feel from having access to so much and so many resources, and it not feeling like it's not enough to eliminate the poverty that you're surrounded by, right? It's right. It's like, because with that, for some people, I would imagine would be a wealth of or a freight, as you shared earlier, of guilt and shame over, I have so much, and how can these people have so little? And not wanting to exist in that world, which is, I understand why people with money, move as far away from the city so that they don't have to experience that weight of guilt and shame. There's a powerlessness in that.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you look at it from that point of view, because that would be just as true. You'd be coming out of the theatre, but you'd be tripping over people in the street. You wouldn't be able to avoid people dying of horrible diseases and poverty and typhoid, and the kind of people washing up on, washing around your feet. And you wouldn't have been able to get away from it. And that, I guess, cognitive dissonance is what they call it. We'll all do anything to get away from something, from irreconcilable feelings. The kind of pleased that we're living this amazing life, but the guilt, or the kind of, that could hit anybody, whichever way when you're looking down or you're looking up,
What was the link we talked about typhoid fever. We talked
Mm,
about humiliation and reversal of fortune,
mm,
and extreme economic circumstances.
mm.
But I also noticed a through line of caffeine being used.
Caffeine.
Yeah, caffeine, and
Mm,
and at first I kind of had the same response as you did as I'm reading your book, and I was like,
mm,
caffeine. And
mm.
then I read, I went down this Google wormhole of the number of accomplished uh, people from the past who've died from caffeine overdose, and how after 5 cups of coffee or 200 milligrams of caffeine,
Mm,
one can start to become delusional. And it
mm,
seems to tie into the idea of, we're talking about inflammation in the brain,
mm,
because caffeine can inflame the brain, as could withdrawing from caffeine. So I
mm.
was wondering how much of, and once again, we understand that you're a historian and not a psychologist or neuroscientist, but how in your research, how much did you see caffeine or coffee playing into it?
I'll have to be honest with you. I mean, I mentioned it, and I remember the moment that it comes up. Um, they're giving it's in the notes for Madame M, written by um, Joseph Capgrath, who was her psychiatrist, and he's asking her, he's asking about her. He's just making notes essentially about her backstory. Where she'd grown up, whether there was anything physical he could see. They were big on tapping the patella, the knee, to see if the reflexes. They kind of make notes on how good your reflexes are. And he makes the point of saying we don't notice anything in her backstory apart from her only vice is coffee. And I'll be honest, it sort of made me smile. I thought, because I thought, um, I thought, gosh, that's quite I don't know, quite a controlling way of looking at her. But actually, yes, I think maybe you've made me think about this, that perhaps, and it is a drug at the end of the day, and it's easy to forget that, and anything that was kind of inflaming, potentially, if she was drinking a lot of strong coffee, that could certainly have been part of it. And he was a clever man. Okay, his kind of points of reference, and sometimes the way he talks about people socially is dated and it feels very, very antiquated, and you can suddenly feel the gap of years about her schooling, or whether she'd been overeducated, that kind of stuff. But actually, maybe he was onto something very early about how powerful caffeine could be, or maybe it was linked because he also noticed her childhood fever, and so they were obviously thinking about this. They would have these kind of symposia where they'd all get together. Sometimes and this was the case with Madame M, they'd literally sort of bring the delusional case study out into this kind of auditorium and share notes and talk about present their case study to their peers. And they were obviously thinking about, obviously, pre any kind of scanning or pre much anything sophisticated in terms of diagnostics, but they kind of knew that it wasn't all going to be psychological, and they were trying to feel their way. And the mention of coffee, maybe he was onto something. Maybe he knew something. He instinctively felt that there was a kind of inflammation story there that was part of. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, for sharing that. Because I notice, like, when I get on coffee, like, it completely dysregulates me. It makes me a bit more anxious. And I'm definitely not drinking 5 cups of coffee, so I am not interested in knowing what that feels like. But when you're talking about Robert Burton in the book, and I found this really fascinating on page
Mm.
106, how you said that astrology and melancholy were his masters, and that he couldn't resist looking into the future. To me,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
alludes to, like, looking into the future as being something that caused him more distress. Can you share more
Oh,
about
this is
that?
so interesting, and especially given your work and what this amazing podcast, what the themes that run through this. He is an amazing story. He was a scholar in Oxford, Robert Burton, brilliant man, and he understood much more. He understood everything. You know, he was so erudite. He knew that birth charts were kind of outdated. They'd been very popular for hundreds of years, but they were laughed at by the time he was in the high office in Oxford University. But yet, you know, secretly, he wasn't above it. And so he writes really interestingly about how we're kind of, as humans, we can't help ourselves wanting to know the future, but that once we know the future, so he kind of laughs at people that believe their horoscopes, even though he believed his. But he knows that once you know something, once you believe that you're going to die on a given day, or that there's this kind of, you can make it come true, and that it can be a terrible trap. And that belief about what's going to happen to you, which follows kind of this human self-sabotaging, desperate curiosity about the future. He understood it completely, and he literally, you know, had complete contempt for it in his writing. But I argue, and I think, you know, I've got the paper trail. He believed it. He'd been to an astrologer when he was a very young man, probably suffering from what we'd now call severe depression. He dropped, you know, there's blanks in his university education, and melancholy, of course, very, very crudely, but is a kind of analog for what we think of now as depression, a really kind of deep sadness. I mean, at his time, it had other qualities too. It was sort of being quite high-minded, being kind of extra sensitive. So melancholy men were kind of seen as, you know, the classic image of a melancholy man is sort of stretched on a riverbank, staring into the middle distance with a knowing smile. You know, it's quite sort of, it's not seen as an abject state. It's seen as something quite high-minded. But nonetheless, looking at him, I think it's quite clear he was plagued with depression, what we'd now think of as depression, what they then called melancholy. And he went to this sort of superstar astrologer in the City of London, and was told that he would die suddenly, and the chart was drawn up with the stars and the alignment of the planets and so on and so forth. And even though it was kind of, as I say, outdated by this point in terms of, like so many things, I guess it takes a while to catch up, doesn't it? It's like not everyone has contemporary furniture. We all have our grandmother's sofa or chest of drawers, right? We have stuff in our houses, in our head that stays on even when everything is supposedly modern. And so I think a lot of the population probably secretly, well, we still do, don't we? A lot of people still do believe their horoscopes, but he's very clear in his front brain, as it were, that that's a really dangerous trap, and he implores people not to be able to stay present, and because it's such a terribly dangerous thing to know your future. You will make it come true. So he's a really intriguing person, because he's writing about, you know, it's like two people.
I love that. I love that, this idea of just staying present. You know, that goes back to Eckhart Tolle, the power of the now. And for people who listen to my podcast, they know I have an astrologer on who talks about the next month or 3 months. And for me, it does provide kind of a scaffolding.
And me too. I'm.
Oh, you use astrology also?
Well, I had a birth chart done for me by a friend of the family when I was 9, and I look at it all the time. Or I read Robert Burton's book, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Like, as I use it like the I Ching, you know. So I'm definitely like I will look up the bit. So I'm partial to. I think there's huge power in it. I don't rubbish it at all. I just I took the warning from him to just, you know, we can't resist it, and it can be scaffolding, and it can be guiding, and it can give you a structure for your day. Like I say, like the I Ching, and I literally look at his book. I have a very old copy that a psychiatrist gave me, so it's kind of precious. When I was writing the book, he very kindly gave me this really, really old copy, and I'll open it up and I'll see and it feels like there's meaning in that. So I desire to look for meaning and to look for structure, like when we began the conversation. It's strong in all of us, and I don't think we should fight it. I think there's mystery, and that's okay.
And I think that's a beautiful place to wrap it up, because it seems like at the end of the day, when we're talking about delusions, we're talking about, one is learning how to see each other and meet each other where we're at. Two, you talk about how it gives us purpose. It gives us an itinerary. It gives us direction. And three, we all just want to feel competent on some level. We want to feel like we have some agency or autonomy over our lives, and we'll fight for that, whether it's based in reality or in delusions. But it's a part of what drives us. Is there anything else you wanted the listeners to take away from your book?
I think that's beautifully put. And, I suppose also peace, I would add to that list, that we, and maybe that's something that we could try and do, just to try to resolve irreconcilable conflicts. As you were saying, I think that's a really good idea. I'm going to try and do to let those things out as you go along, and not let irreconcilable feelings or conflicts ratchet up. But to kind of, because delusions talk to us about this desperate need to have some peace, just to not try and hold warring ideas in our head, and I just think the psychic energy that we use up by doing that can be terribly damaging. And if we all tried to, it's easier said than done. But maybe what I mean is delusions can show us not only the strategies we employ when things have got really bad, but also how we might try and preempt that by just being more aware of those if something is born out of conflict, and how we might find some peace without having to construct an alternative reality to get some.
Yeah, with Leah B, you talk about how she wrote letters as a way to kind of let the air out and release some of that psychic or mental tension. And I think that's the power of journaling, to kind of express what's bothering us, or what's exciting us, or what's guiding us, get more clarity.
Oh, for sure. That's a really interesting point. Yeah, and letters appear in the book a lot, and they're incredibly articulate, much more articulate. Yeah, I buy that completely.
Last question I have, Victoria Shepherd, and we, like I said, we understand you're a historian, not a psychologist, but I ask this of all my guests, because always imagine there's one person listening in who may be on the precipice of wanting to end their life. Before you kill yourself, what would you say to them, Victoria Shepherd?
I would say to them, all of us, you are the solidarity that I have seen in writing my book about people who experience delusions is unarguable. So many people are dealing with incredibly difficult realities, and there are ways of speaking and sharing strategies and comforts from other people who have experienced a similar feeling that they can't bear their reality, and found that they can bear their reality if they can hold on. And I think I personally, as a historian, recommend looking back and finding solace in people who've done just that in the past, because I found it.
Thank you, Victoria Shepherd. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for you going to get help, for you calling the 1-800-SUICIDE, 1-800-273-TALKS, or if you're in London or Budapest or Mexico or wherever you are in the world, there are international suicide hotline prevention numbers you can call, text, chat. There are groups you can join. There are financial resources. It's all linked in all of the show notes. You can always go to thrivewithleo.com for one-on-one coaching with yours truly. Let's get to tomorrow together. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you so much.